I was staring at my own signature on a document I had never signed when I realized my life in the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association was about to become a legal nightmare. The paper trembled in my hands as I sat at my kitchen table in Phoenix, Arizona, trying to process what I was seeing. The document was a consent form for special assessment and landscaping modification, dated 3 weeks ago, allegedly authorizing the HOA to remove the 2 mature mesquite trees from my front yard and replace them with generic shrubs. The signature looked eerily similar to mine, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never put pen to that paper. My name is Patrick Grayson, and I had lived in this planned community for 5 years without major incident. Sure, the HOA had its quirks, like any other suburban neighborhood association, but nothing had prepared me for what I was holding in my hands. The document had arrived in my mailbox that morning with a cheerful note from the HOA president, thanking me for my cooperation in the beautification project. I had rushed outside immediately to find a work crew already measuring my trees with surveying equipment. I grabbed my phone and dialed the HOA office before I could second-guess myself. The receptionist, a pleasant woman named Janet, answered on the 3rd ring. Willow Creek Estates HOA, how may I help you? This is Patrick Grayson on Sagaro Drive. I need to speak with someone about a document I just received. There is a serious problem. One moment, please. The hold music was some generic instrumental that did nothing to calm my racing heart. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes, a woman's voice came on the line. I recognized it immediately as Barbara Morrison, the HOA president and the epitome of what people online called a Karen. She was in her late 40s, with that specific haircut that seemed to come standard with the personality type, and she had made it her personal mission to ensure every blade of grass in Willow Creek Estates met her exacting standards. Mr. Grayson, this is Barbara. I understand you have questions about your consent form. Questions. Barbara, I never signed this document. This is not my signature. There was a pause, and I could practically hear her jaw tighten through the phone. Mr. Grayson, I have the form right here in front of me. Your signature is clearly visible. Perhaps you simply forgot. You did attend the community meeting 3 weeks ago where these forms were distributed. I did not attend that meeting. I was in Tucson visiting my sister. I have gas receipts and restaurant bills that prove it. And even if I had been there, I would never have agreed to remove my trees. Those mesquites are the only shade on my property in the summer. Well, the form is signed and dated. The project is moving forward as planned. We have already contracted the landscaping company, and they will begin work on your property Monday morning. The dismissiveness in her tone made my blood pressure spike. Barbara, I am telling you right now, I did not sign this form. Someone forged my signature, and I want to know who and why. That is a very serious accusation, Mr. Grayson. I suggest you be careful about making such claims without evidence. The evidence is that I never signed it. Stop the work on my property immediately, or I will call the police. She laughed, actually laughed, a condescending sound that made me want to throw my phone across the room. The police. For an HOA matter, Mr. Grayson, I think you are overreacting. The board approved this beautification project unanimously, and we have consent forms from all affected homeowners. Perhaps you should review your own records before making wild accusations. My records show I was not even in Phoenix when this was supposedly signed. Listen to me very carefully, Barbara. Do not touch my trees. I am pursuing this legally. You do what you feel you need to do, Mr. Grayson. But the project is moving forward as scheduled. Have a nice day. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there, phone in hand, shaking with anger and disbelief. This could not be happening. I had heard horror stories about HOAs overstepping their bounds, but forgery, that was an actual crime. I took several deep breaths and tried to think logically. First, I needed evidence. I pulled up my bank statements and email from 3 weeks ago, printing out everything that proved I was in Tucson on the date the form was supposedly signed. Credit card charges at restaurants, a hotel bill, even a photo I had posted on social media with my sister at a local winery. The timestamp clearly visible. Next, I needed expert verification that the signature was forged. I did a quick internet search for handwriting experts in Phoenix and found a forensic document examiner named Robert Chen, who had testified in several high-profile court cases. I called his office and explained the situation to his assistant. "Doctor, Chen can see you tomorrow afternoon at 2, she said. "Please bring the questioned document and at least 5 examples of your genuine signature from different time periods." "I will be there. Thank you." I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering signature samples from old tax returns, bank documents, and contracts. As I compared them to the signature on the consent form, I could see subtle differences. The way the P in Patrick curved, the spacing between letters, the pressure of the pen strokes. It was close enough to fool a casual observer, but it was not my handwriting. That evening, I sat on my front porch and looked at my mesquite trees. They were probably 40 years old, maybe older, their twisted trunks and delicate leaves providing blessed shade during the brutal Arizona summers. The thought of losing them to some bureaucratic landscaping project made me sick. My neighbor, Tom Williams, came out to water his lawn and waved. Tom was a retired accountant, a decent guy who mostly kept to himself. I walked over to his property line. "Hey, Tom, did you get one of those consent forms about the landscaping project?" He nodded, a frown crossing his face. "Yeah, about a month ago. I was not happy about it, but the letter said it was mandatory, something about bringing all the properties into compliance with new aesthetic standards." "Did you sign it?" I did not have much choice. Barbara showed up at my door with the form and said if I did not sign voluntarily, the board would invoke their emergency powers and do it anyway. Said it would be easier on everyone if I just cooperated. My stomach dropped. "Did she watch you sign it?" "Yeah, she stood right there while I filled it out." "Why?" "Because the form I received has a signature that looks like mine, but I never signed it. I was not even in town when it was dated." Tom's eyes widened. "You are saying they forged it?" "That is exactly what I am saying." "Did anyone else on the street mention this?" "Now that you mention it, the Hendersons down the block moved out pretty suddenly last month. Jim said something about not wanting to deal with HOA drama anymore. I wonder if they had problems too." This was getting worse by the minute. I thanked Tom and went back inside, my mind racing. If Barbara was forging signatures on multiple forms, this was not just about my trees. This was systematic fraud. Saturday morning, I drove out to the Hendersons' new place in Scottsdale. I had gotten their new address from the community directory before they updated it. Jim Henderson answered the door looking surprised to see me. "Patrick, what are you doing here?" "I need to ask you about why you moved. Did it have anything to do with the HOA?" Jim's expression darkened. He invited me in, and over coffee, he told me a story that made my blood run cold. The HOA had claimed Jim had signed a form authorizing them to paint his house a different color to match new community standards. Jim insisted he had never signed any such form. When he refused to allow the painting, the HOA had begun fining him $500 a day for non-compliance. The fines had racked up to over $15,000 before Jim and his wife decided it was easier to just sell and leave. I knew something was wrong, but I could not prove anything, Jim said. We just wanted out. Fighting an HOA is like fighting City Hall, you know. They have all the power and all the money. Did you keep any of the documents? Sarah might have them in storage. Why? What is going on? I explained my situation, and Jim's face went pale. You think they forged my signature too? I think it is a real possibility. Would you be willing to testify if this goes to court? Absolutely. If they did this to us, if they made us sell our home based on forged documents, I want them to pay. I left the Hendersons with a promise to keep them updated. Sarah was going to dig through their stored files to find any HOA documents they had kept. Meanwhile, I had my appointment with Dr. Chen the next afternoon. Sunday dragged by slowly. I spent most of the day documenting everything I could about the HOA, their recent projects, board meeting minutes from their website, and anything else that might be relevant. I also drafted a formal letter to the HOA board demanding they cease all work on my property and preserve the consent form as evidence in a potential legal case. Monday afternoon, I sat in Dr. Chen's office in downtown Phoenix, watching as he examined the consent form under a magnified light. He was a precise man in his 60s, with careful movements and an intense focus that inspired confidence. "Bring me your genuine signature examples, please," he said without looking up. I handed over the folder of documents I had prepared. Dr. Chen spent the next hour comparing the signatures, using various tools and techniques I did not fully understand. He took photographs, made measurements, and occasionally muttered to himself in what sounded like Mandarin. Finally, he sat back and removed his glasses. "Mr. Grayson, in my professional opinion, the signature on this consent form is not authentic. It is a reasonably skilled forgery, but there are several indicators of simulation. Simulation. Someone attempting to copy your signature, likely by tracing or using a light box. The line quality is too uniform, too careful. Genuine signatures have natural variations in pressure and speed. This one shows evidence of drawn rather than written strokes. Additionally, several letter formations are inconsistent with your genuine signatures. The G in Grayson, for example, has a different loop structure. Relief and anger flooded through me in equal measure. Can you put that in a report? I will have a formal analysis prepared by Wednesday. I should warn you, my services are not inexpensive. The initial examination is $1,200, and if I need to testify in court, my rate is $300 per hour plus expenses. That is fine. I need this documented properly. I paid the initial fee and left his office with a receipt and a promise of the full report by midweek. Now I had expert confirmation. The next step was law enforcement. The Phoenix Police Department's white-collar crime unit was located in a nondescript office building on the west side of town. I walked in Tuesday morning with my folder of evidence and asked to speak with a detective about forgery. The detective who came out to meet me was a woman in her 30s named Jennifer Martinez. She had tired eyes but a sharp manner that suggested she did not miss much. "Mr. Grayson, come on back." In her small office, I laid out everything. The consent form, my alibi evidence, Dr. Chen's preliminary findings, Jim Henderson's story, and my suspicions about the HOA president. Detective Martinez listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is interesting. HOA fraud cases are tricky because they exist in this gray area between civil and criminal law, but forgery is definitely criminal. Let me ask you something. You have any idea who might have forged this signature?" Barbara Morrison, the HOA president, is the most likely suspect. She is the one who would have access to signature samples from other documents, and she is the one pushing these projects. But you do not have direct evidence linking her to the forgery. Not yet. But if you subpoena the HOA's records, I bet you would find a pattern. I am not the only one this happened to. Detective Martinez nodded slowly. Here is what I can do. I will open a case file and start a preliminary investigation. I will need the original consent form, not a copy. I will also need your handwriting expert to provide his full report directly to me. If we can establish that multiple forgeries occurred, we can treat this as a larger fraud case, which will give me more resources to investigate. What should I do in the meantime? Document everything. If the HOA contacts you, keep records of every conversation. If they try to access your property, do not physically stop them, but make it clear you do not consent and call the police immediately. And get a lawyer. Even though this is a criminal matter, you are probably going to end up in civil court with the HOA as well. I left the police station feeling both encouraged and overwhelmed. This was escalating fast, but at least I had official backing now. I called a real estate attorney named David Park, whose name I had gotten from a colleague. He agreed to see me that afternoon. David Park's office was in a high-rise in downtown Scottsdale. He was a lean man in his early 40s with an intense focus and a reputation for not backing down from fights. HOA forgery case, he said as I sat down. That is a new one. Walk me through it. I went through the whole story again. David asked pointed questions about the HOA's governing documents, their authority to make property modifications, and the specific language in the consent form. Okay, he said when I finished. Here is the situation. Even if they had a genuine signature from you, they probably do not have the legal authority to remove established trees from your property without a compelling reason related to safety or CC&R violations. The fact that the signature is forged makes this much easier. I am going to draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA and their landscaping contractor, putting them on notice that any work on your property will be treated as trespass and destruction of property. I am also going to file for a temporary restraining order to prevent them from touching your trees while we sort this out. How much is this going to cost me? My retainer is $5,000. This type of case could run anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 total, depending on how hard they fight. But here is the good news. If we can prove forgery and malicious conduct, you can sue for damages, attorney's fees, and potentially punitive damages. You might come out ahead financially. I signed the retainer agreement and wrote the check, watching a significant chunk of my savings disappear. But this was too important to back down now. Wednesday morning, I received Dr. Chen's formal report via courier. It was 15 pages of detailed analysis, complete with photographs and technical explanations, all concluding unequivocally that the signature on the consent form was a forgery. I immediately forwarded a copy to Detective Martinez and David Park. That afternoon, David called me. I have some interesting news. I filed the TRO application this morning, and I also did some digging into Willow Creek Estates, HOA's recent activities. In the past year, they have undertaken 5 major beautification projects affecting 32 homes. I pulled property records and found that 6 of those homeowners sold their properties within 3 months of the projects being announced. That is an unusually high turnover rate. You think they have been running a systematic scheme? I think it is possible. Here is a theory. Barbara Morrison or someone on the board is forging consent forms to push through expensive projects. Homeowners who resist get hit with fines and legal threats until they either comply or sell. Meanwhile, someone connected to the board could be benefiting financially, either through kickbacks from contractors or by purchasing the properties themselves at distressed prices. That is elaborate. White-collar crime usually is. I have a paralegal reaching out to the other homeowners who sold recently to see if they will talk to us. If we can establish a pattern, this becomes a much bigger case. Thursday morning, a process server delivered the temporary restraining order to the HOA office and to the landscaping contractor. Barbara Morrison called me within an hour, and she was furious. How dare you file legal action against this association? You are creating a hostile environment and interfering with legitimate community improvement projects. Barbara, I never signed that consent form. I have a forensic handwriting expert who confirmed the signature is a forgery. That is a crime. That is absolutely ridiculous. You are making wild accusations because you do not want to comply with community standards. This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior that ruins neighborhoods. Then I am sure you would have no problem providing documentation of how you obtained that signature. Security camera footage from the meeting, witness statements, anything that proves I signed it. She was silent for a moment. The meeting was informal. We do not record everything. But you said I signed it at the meeting, so there must have been witnesses. I do not have to explain our processes to you. This is harassment, and the board will be discussing sanctions against you for this behavior. You do that. And while you are at it, explain to the board that the police are investigating this as forgery and fraud. I am sure they will be very interested in that. I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. You have no idea what you are starting. I think I have a pretty good idea. I am protecting my property rights, which is something the HOA is supposed to support, not violate. She hung up without another word. I immediately called Detective Martinez and reported the conversation. Good, she said. Let her be angry. Angry people make mistakes. By the way, I spoke with your handwriting expert. His credentials are solid, and his report is thorough. I am moving forward with the investigation. I have requested records from the HOA, and if they do not comply voluntarily, I will get a warrant. Friday afternoon, David Park called with an update. The TRO hearing is Monday morning. The HOA hired a lawyer, a guy named Richard Foster. He is already trying to argue that this is a civil matter and the TRO is inappropriate. But we have the forgery evidence, so I am confident the judge will side with us, at least temporarily. What happens after the TRO? We move to a preliminary injunction, which would block them for the duration of the legal proceedings. Meanwhile, I have been talking to those other homeowners. 3 of them are willing to meet with us. They all have similar stories about suddenly being told they had violated HOA rules or had agreed to modifications they never actually approved. Saturday, I met with David and 3 former Willow Creek residents at a coffee shop in Tempe. Besides the Hendersons, there were Marcus and Linda Thompson, who had been forced to remove a custom garden they had spent years developing, and Robert Yu, who had been told he had agreed to change his roof tiles to match a new community standard. All 3 had documents with their signatures that they insisted were not authentic. All 3 had been hit with mounting fines when they refused to comply. All 3 had eventually sold their homes rather than continue fighting. We need to get these analyzed, David said, collecting the documents. If we can prove multiple forgeries, this goes from a personal dispute to a criminal enterprise. Robert, you spoke up. There is something else you should know. After I sold my house, I saw it listed again 3 months later by a real estate investment company called Desert Horizon Properties. They bought it from the people I sold to for $15,000 more than they paid me, which means those people flipped it fast. When I looked into it, I found that Desert Horizon had purchased 4 other homes in Willow Creek in the past year, all from people who had sold quickly. David's eyes lit up. "Did you find out who owns Desert Horizon Properties?" I tried, but it is hidden behind an LLC. "The registered agent is a law firm in Scottsdale." "I can get that information," David said. "This is good work, Robert. If there is a financial connection between the HOA board and these property purchases, we have them." Sunday evening, I was grilling dinner on my back patio when I heard someone knock on my front door. I walked through the house and found 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Patrick Grayson." "Yes, that is me. What is going on?" "We received a complaint from your HOA about a threatening phone call made to their president, Barbara Morrison. She says you called her Thursday and threatened her with violence." My jaw dropped. "That is completely false. I did call her Thursday, but I never threatened her. I told her the police were investigating the forged signature." The older officer, whose name tag read Dalton, nodded. "She played us a recording of the call. We did not hear any direct threats, but she is claiming she felt threatened by your tone and the implication that she would face consequences. She is trying to intimidate me because I am exposing her fraud. I have an active investigation with Detective Martinez in the white-collar crime unit." "This is retaliation." Officer Dalton exchanged a glance with his partner. "We will make a note of that. Just to be clear, have you made any threats against Miss Morrison or any other HOA board members?" "Absolutely not. The only threats I have made are legal ones. I have a lawyer, and we are handling this through the proper channels." "Okay. We are going to document this call and move on, but I would suggest you avoid any direct contact with Miss Morrison going forward. Let your lawyer handle all communication." After they left, I called David immediately and told him what happened. "She is panicking," he said. "This is classic intimidation tactics. Do not let it get to you, and absolutely do not call her again. All communication goes through me from now on." Monday morning, the TRO hearing was held in Maricopa County Superior Court. I sat with David at the plaintiff's table while Barbara Morrison and her attorney Richard Foster sat at the defense table. Barbara kept shooting me hostile glares, but I focused on the judge. Judge Patricia Coleman was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She reviewed our filings, listened to brief arguments from both sides, and then addressed the room. "Mr. Foster, your client is accused of forging a homeowner's signature on a consent form. The plaintiff has provided expert analysis supporting this claim, along with alibi evidence showing he could not have signed the document when and where your client claims. How do you respond to these allegations?" Foster stood up. "Your Honor, this is a civil matter involving HOA governance. The plaintiff is attempting to criminalize a simple administrative process. The HOA has records showing Mr. Grayson's consent, and they acted in good faith based on those records. Did your client witness Mr. Grayson signing this form?" Foster hesitated. "I would need to consult with my client about the specific details of how the form was obtained." "Then consult with her now, please." Foster leaned over and had a whispered conversation with Barbara. When he straightened up, his expression was carefully neutral. "Miss Morrison indicates that the form was submitted through a drop box at the HOA office. She did not personally witness the signature, so she cannot verify that Mr. Grayson actually signed it. She has no reason to believe he did not." Judge Coleman turned to David. "Mr. Park, your evidence." David stood and presented Dr. Chen's report, my alibi documentation, and my sworn statement. The judge reviewed them carefully. "Mr. Foster, absent any credible evidence that your client obtained this signature legitimately, and in light of expert testimony that it is a forgery, I am granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA and any contractors working on their behalf are prohibited from performing any work on Mr. Grayson's property pending resolution of this matter. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. We will reconvene in 30 days for a preliminary injunction hearing. Barbara Morrison's face went red, and she started to stand up, but Foster grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. The judge banged her gavel and we were dismissed. Outside the courtroom, David was practically glowing. That went about as well as we could have hoped. The fact that she referred it to the county attorney means she thinks there is a real crime here. What happens now? We wait for the county attorney to decide whether to prosecute. Meanwhile, we continue building our civil case. I have those other documents from the former homeowners going to Dr. Chen for analysis. If even one of them comes back as a forgery, we have a pattern. The rest of the week was relatively quiet. Detective Martinez called to let me know the county attorney had indeed opened a case and assigned a prosecutor named Amanda Chen, no relation to my handwriting expert. The HOA seemed to be lying low, probably on advice from their attorney. The following Tuesday, Dr. Chen called with results on the documents from the other homeowners. Mr. Grayson, I have completed analysis on the 3 additional documents you provided. All 3 signatures show indicators of forgery consistent with the simulation I found in your document. In fact, I believe they were all forged by the same person. The simulation techniques, the paper positioning, and the pressure patterns are remarkably similar. You can testify to that. Absolutely. This is one of the clearer cases of systematic forgery I have seen in my career. I thanked him and immediately called David and Detective Martinez with the news. Things were about to get very serious for Barbara Morrison. Thursday afternoon, Detective Martinez called. We have made some interesting discoveries. First, we traced ownership of Desert Horizon Properties. The LLC is owned by a holding company, which is owned by another LLC, but we finally got through the shell corporations. 51% ownership belongs to Richard Morrison. Morrison. Is that related to Barbara Morrison, her husband? We are looking into whether she disclosed this conflict of interest to the HOA board. Second, we pulled the HOA's financial records with a warrant. In the past 18 months, they have paid over $300,000 to a landscaping company called Premier Desert Landscaping. The owner of that company is a man named Terry Morrison. Let me guess, another relative, Barbara's brother. We are building a case for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The county attorney is planning to bring charges next week. I felt a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. What had started as a dispute over 2 trees had uncovered a full-blown criminal conspiracy. What should I expect? There will probably be arrests. The HOA board members who were aware of the scheme will be charged. Your civil case will probably get easier once the criminal charges are public. And you should prepare for media attention. This is the kind of story that news outlets love. She was right about the media attention. The following Wednesday, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office announced criminal charges against Barbara Morrison, her husband Richard Morrison, and her brother Terry Morrison, along with 2 other HOA board members who had knowingly participated in the scheme. The charges included forgery, fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. The Arizona Republic ran a front-page story about the case. My phone started ringing with calls from local news stations wanting interviews. David advised me to do one carefully controlled interview to tell my side, so I agreed to sit down with a reporter from KPNX News. The interview aired on the evening news that Thursday. I explained how I had discovered the forged signature, pursued the investigation, and uncovered what appeared to be a years-long scheme to defraud homeowners. The reporter also interviewed Jim Henderson and Robert Yu, who shared their stories. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails and calls from other Willow Creek residents who had felt pressured by the HOA but had not known how to fight back. Several more came forward with suspicious documents they had allegedly signed. Barbara Morrison was arrested on Friday morning. The local news showed footage of her being led out of her house in handcuffs, her face hidden behind her hands. Her husband and brother were arrested the same day. The two other board members, a woman named Patricia Kendall and a man named Stephen Hughes, turned themselves in with their lawyers. David filed an amended civil lawsuit on behalf of myself and 8 other homeowners, seeking damages for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of fiduciary duty. We also sued the HOA itself for failing to properly oversee its board members. The preliminary injunction hearing 2 weeks later was almost anticlimactic. With criminal charges pending and overwhelming evidence of forgery, Judge Coleman granted the injunction without much argument. The HOA, now being run by an emergency board appointed by the remaining non-indicted members, agreed to cease all contested projects and submit to an independent audit. The criminal trial began 4 months later. I sat in the courtroom for most of the proceedings, watching as the prosecution laid out the scheme in meticulous detail. The evidence showed that Barbara Morrison had been forging homeowner signatures for nearly 2 years. She would push through expensive landscaping projects using her brother's company, which would overbill the HOA and kick back a portion of the profits to Barbara. Meanwhile, when homeowners resisted the forced modifications, they would be hit with fines and violations until many chose to sell. Barbara's husband would then purchase the properties through Desert Horizon Properties at below market prices, make minimal improvements, and resell them at substantial profits. The prosecution estimated the Morrisons had profited approximately $800,000 from the scheme. The HOA had been overcharged by at least $400,000 for landscaping work that was often unnecessary or poorly done. The handwriting evidence was damning. Dr. Chen testified for an entire afternoon, walking the jury through his analysis of the forged signatures. The prosecution also presented testimony from 15 homeowners who identified documents with their signatures that they had never actually signed. The defense tried to argue that Barbara had legitimately believed the homeowners had consented, that the signatures must have been signed by spouses or family members, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the financial connections to her husband and brother made those arguments ring hollow. After a 3-week trial, the jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Barbara Morrison broke down crying when the verdict was read. Her husband sat stone-faced while her brother stared at the table. Sentencing came 2 months later. Judge Coleman, the same judge who had handled my TRO hearing, was clearly unimpressed with the defendants. "This was not a victimless crime," she said from the bench. "You violated the trust of your neighbors and your community. You used your position of authority to defraud people who had every reason to believe you were acting in their best interests. You forged legal documents, embezzled community funds, and when confronted, attempted to intimidate those who sought to expose your crimes." Barbara Morrison received 4 years in state prison. Her husband received 5 years. Her brother received 3 years. The 2 other board members, who had played smaller roles, received probation and community service. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal convictions. The HOA's insurance carrier agreed to pay $1.2 million to be distributed among the affected homeowners. My share came to approximately $85,000, which more than covered my legal fees and compensated me for the stress and time I had invested in the case. More importantly, the HOA underwent a complete restructuring. New bylaws were implemented requiring transparent governance, independent audits, and homeowner approval for any projects affecting individual properties. The emergency board hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, removing the opportunity for any one person to wield the kind of unchecked power Barbara Morrison had enjoyed. Jim and Sarah Henderson moved back to Willow Creek after the settlement, purchasing a home 2 streets over from their old place. Several other families who had been forced out also returned. There was a sense in the community that something important had been corrected, that justice had actually been served. On a warm evening in March, nearly a year after I had first discovered the forged signature, I sat on my front porch under the shade of my mesquite trees. They had survived the ordeal, standing as tall and defiant as ever. Tom Williams came over with a 6-pack of beer, and we sat drinking and watching the sun set over the Phoenix skyline. "You know, I still cannot believe all that actually happened," Tom said. "It is like something out of a movie." "Tell me about it. All I wanted was to keep my trees." "You did more than that. You probably saved a lot of people a lot of money and grief." I thought about that. It was true that the investigation had stopped the Morrisons from continuing their scheme, and the reforms meant it was less likely something similar would happen in the future. But it had been exhausting, stressful, and expensive, even with the settlement. "I just wish people did not feel like they could get away with things like this," I said. "She really thought she was untouchable. Power does that to people. Especially small power over small kingdoms. HOAs can be the worst for that." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching neighbors walk their dogs and kids ride bikes in the street. Life in Willow Creek Estates had returned to a pleasant normalcy. The following week, I received a letter from the Arizona Attorney General's office. They were conducting a statewide review of HOA governance practices in light of the Willow Creek case. They wanted to interview me about my experience and get my input on potential legislative reforms. I met with an assistant attorney general named Michael Foster, no relation to Barbara's former lawyer, in a conference room at the state capitol. I spent 2 hours describing everything that had happened, from the initial discovery to the final settlement. "What would you say is the biggest vulnerability in the current HOA system?" he asked. "Lack of oversight. Barbara Morrison was able to operate unchecked for years because there was no independent audit, no requirement for transparency, and no easy way for homeowners to challenge decisions. By the time most people realized something was wrong, they had already been victimized. What would you recommend? Mandatory annual audits by independent firms. Requirements that all board meetings be recorded and minutes made available to homeowners. A state-level ombudsman who can investigate complaints and mediate disputes. And serious criminal penalties for board members who abuse their positions, which I think this case has established." He took extensive notes. "This is very helpful. We are looking at proposing legislation next session that would implement many of these safeguards. Would you be willing to testify before the legislature if needed?" "Absolutely." Over the next several months, I became something of an accidental activist for HOA reform. I spoke at community meetings, wrote op-eds for local newspapers, and consulted with legislators drafting new oversight laws. It was not something I had ever planned to do, but it felt important. The legislation passed the following year with bipartisan support. The Homeowner Protection and HOA Accountability Act required annual independent audits for HOAs with more than 50 units, established a state ombudsman's office for HOA disputes, and created enhanced criminal penalties for board members who committed fraud or forgery. It also required HOAs to maintain insurance specifically covering wrongful acts by board members. Governor Katie Hobbs signed the bill in a ceremony at the Capitol. I was invited to attend, along with several other homeowners who had been victimized by HOA abuse. It felt surreal to watch something I had played a role in becoming actual law. Back in Willow Creek Estates, life had settled into a new rhythm. The professional management company ran things efficiently and transparently. Board meetings were well attended now that people trusted the process. There was even a community barbecue where neighbors who had been afraid to speak up during Barbara's reign shared their stories and found solidarity. I remained in my house, under the shade of my mesquite trees, grateful that I had trusted my instincts when I saw that forged signature. It would have been easier to ignore it, to just let them take the trees and avoid the conflict. But sometimes the easy path is not the right one. 2 years after the initial discovery, I was working in my home office when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young woman in her late 20s holding a folder. "Mr. Grayson, my name is Emily Ross. I live in a planned community in Mesa, and I think my HOA president forged my signature on a document. Someone gave me your name and said you might be able to help me understand what to do." I invited her in and listened to her story. It was disturbingly similar to mine. A consent form she had never signed, a project she had never approved, and a board president who dismissed her concerns. I walked her through the steps I had taken, getting the document examined by an expert, gathering evidence, contacting law enforcement, and finding a good attorney. "The important thing is not to let them intimidate you," I said. "They are counting on you to back down because fighting seems too hard. But you have rights, and if they forged your signature, they committed a crime. Do not let them get away with it." Emily left with a list of resources and a determined look on her face. I heard from her a few months later that her case had been resolved. The handwriting expert confirmed forgery, the HOA president resigned under pressure, and the board agreed to drop the contested project. It was not as dramatic as my case, but it was another small victory for accountability. I realized that my experience, as difficult as it had been, had given me something valuable, knowledge and perspective that I could share with others facing similar situations. I started a blog documenting HOA abuse cases and providing resources for homeowners. It grew slowly but steadily, becoming a hub for people seeking advice and support. 3 years after the initial incident, I attended Barbara Morrison's parole hearing. She had served just over 2 years and was eligible for early release. I sat in the hearing room along with several other victims, prepared to make a statement if needed. Barbara looked different than I remembered. Prison had aged her, or perhaps it was just the absence of the arrogance and self-importance that had defined her before. She read a prepared statement expressing remorse for her actions, acknowledging the harm she had caused, and promising to make amends. The parole board asked her questions about her plans if released. She said she had been working with a counselor, had completed vocational training, and had a job lined up at a retail store. She would be living with her daughter and staying away from any position of authority or trust. When it was time for victim statements, Jim Henderson spoke about how the scheme had forced him to sell his home and disrupted his retirement plans. Robert Yu talked about the garden his wife had built over 15 years that was destroyed based on a forged signature. I spoke about the violation of trust and the damage done to community cohesion. Barbara listened to each statement with her head down, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. When we finished, she looked up and said, "I know saying I am sorry is not enough. I know I cannot undo what I did. But I want you all to know that I think about what I did every day, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be better than I was." The parole board granted her early release with strict conditions, including restitution payments and prohibition from serving on any HOA board or similar governing body. I left the hearing with mixed feelings. I believed in second chances, but I also believed in consequences. Barbara was facing both. Life continued. I eventually started dating someone I met at a community organizing meeting, a teacher named Olivia Dixon who had her own HOA horror story from a previous home. We bonded over shared experiences and a mutual commitment to holding institutions accountable. She moved into my house after a year, and we got married under the mesquite trees in my front yard. The trees had become something of a symbol for me. They represented the importance of standing firm, of not letting others uproot what mattered just because they had temporary authority. They also reminded me that growth takes time, that roots go deep, and that shade is something you provide not just for yourself but for others. 5 years after I discovered the forged signature, I was invited to speak at a national conference on HOA governance in Washington, D.C. I shared my story with an audience of legislators, attorneys, and homeowner advocates from across the country. The response was overwhelming. State after state was dealing with similar issues, and my case had become a template for how to fight back. During a break, a congressman from Florida approached me. "Your case inspired legislation in my state," he said. "We passed a law requiring criminal background checks for HOA board members and mandatory bonding for anyone handling community funds. It is already making a difference." That was the real victory, I realized. Not the settlement money or the convictions, but the systemic changes that would protect future homeowners from going through what I had experienced. Barbara Morrison had tried to abuse her power for personal gain, and in the process, she had sparked a movement for reform that was spreading across the country. I returned to Phoenix energized and focused. The blog had grown into a full nonprofit organization with volunteers helping homeowners navigate HOA disputes. We provided referrals to attorneys, handwriting experts, and other professionals. We educated people about their rights and the proper channels for addressing grievances. And we lobbied for stronger laws and better enforcement. Olivia became involved too, using her skills as an educator to develop training materials for new homeowners about HOA governance. We held workshops throughout the Phoenix area, teaching people how to read CC and Articles, understand their rights, and participate effectively in community governance. My mesquite trees continued to grow, their canopy expanding each year, providing shade not just for my property, but spreading over the sidewalk where neighbors and strangers passed by. People would sometimes stop and ask about them, and I would tell the story of how I almost lost them to a forged signature and a corrupt HOA president. The story always ended the same way, with the reminder that standing up for what is right is rarely easy, but it is always worth it. That documents should be questioned, authority should be verified, and that your signature on a piece of paper means something important that should never be forged or taken lightly. Barbara Morrison served out her parole and disappeared from public life. Her husband Richard sold Desert Horizon properties and moved to Nevada. Her brother Terry worked construction jobs and stayed out of trouble. The other board members rebuilt their lives quietly, staying far away from HOA governance. Willow Creek Estates thrived under professional management and transparent oversight. Property values recovered and even increased as the community's reputation improved. The scandal that had once threatened to define the neighborhood became instead a story of resilience and reform. I kept the framed copy of the forged consent form in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It reminded me that evil often comes in mundane forms, that corruption can hide behind bureaucracy, and that ordinary people have more power than they realize when they refuse to be intimidated. It also reminded me that truth matters, that evidence matters, and that experts like Dr. Chen, who dedicate their careers to uncovering the truth, play a crucial role in justice. Without his analysis, without his willingness to testify, the case might have gone nowhere. Technical expertise and careful documentation had been just as important as moral outrage and determination. As I sat on my porch one evening, now 7 years after the initial incident, I reflected on how much had changed. The trees were taller, the neighborhood was healthier, and I had found purpose in helping others navigate similar challenges. What had started as a personal violation had become a catalyst for positive change that extended far beyond my own property line. Tom Williams came over, as he often did, and we shared our customary evening beers. He was retiring soon and planning to travel with his wife. "You know, you could write a book about all this," he said. "People would be interested. Maybe someday. Right now I am focused on making sure it does not happen to other people." "You have done that. You really have. This whole community is different because you did not back down." I appreciated the sentiment, but I knew the truth was more complicated. The community was different because a lot of people had refused to back down. Jim Henderson, Robert Yu, the other homeowners who came forward, Detective Martinez, David Park, Dr. Chen, the prosecutors, the legislators, even Judge Coleman. It had taken all of us to create meaningful change. That was perhaps the most important lesson, that fighting injustice is not a solitary act. It requires building coalitions, gathering evidence, finding allies, and using every available system and resource to hold the powerful accountable. One person with a legitimate grievance can start the process, but real change requires community. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped from scorching to merely warm, that brief window of comfortable evening air that makes Phoenix bearable. Somewhere in the neighborhood, kids played basketball in a driveway. A dog barked happily at something only it could perceive. Life was normal and good. And in my front yard, 2 mesquite trees that almost became victims of forgery and fraud continued their steady growth, their roots deep in Arizona soil, their branches reaching toward the sky, providing shade and shelter for anyone who passed beneath them. They stood as living proof that sometimes, when you stand your ground and refuse to let others rewrite your story, you can change not just your own outcome, but the rules of the game for everyone who comes after.